And so it is with great pleasure that on behalf of Authenticum, I welcome Professor Duncan Storik to Sacred Heart Church tonight. Professor of Architecture at the University of Notre Dame, Mr. Storik's teaching, research, and practice grows out of a commitment to the principles of classical architecture and the new urbanism. He holds a BS in architecture from the University of Virginia and a Master's of Architecture from Yale University. He helped form the Society for Catholic Liturgy and found the Sacred Architecture Journal, of which he is editor. He was co-editor of the monograph Reconquering Sacred Space and is author most recently of The Church Building a Sacred Space, and I thought I saw some copies back there of that book. In addition to publishing and lecturing, Professor Storik has also organized conferences on sacred architecture and seminars in Italy, where they do have a few churches. He has built work in Ireland, Indiana, Nebraska, Texas, Kentucky, and many other states, including my home state of California. He is my old home state, I meant to say. He is currently working on projects throughout the United States, including college campuses. Among these are my own Aquinas College, where, as I said, he's currently serving as our consultant as we seek to build a new chapel as part of our Catholic renewal efforts. The title of tonight's talk is Sacred Art and Architecture, the Contributions of Pope Benedict XVI. Please welcome Duncan Storik.
Isn't he good? He should get his own department at Aquinas College and do stuff with this, with all this brilliance and energy. It's an honor to be in Grand Rapids, and I hate microphones. It's an honor to be in the ugly basement of a very beautiful church. That church is a knockout. Does anybody go to church here? That is a knockout. When we drove up, Tom Stroka drove me here, and we're classicists, so we came by chariot. And we pulled in, and I said, that's my kind of church. I could design that. And people used to pay architects to do that. I don't know what happened. But anyway, it's a beautiful building, and honor to be here, and really thank Authenticum for doing this. And I'll try to give you an authentic lecture, because I believe in authentic materials, authentic liturgy, authentic architecture, that's all a joke. At any rate, but I do want to start off with a very important point. You've all heard liturgist jokes, right? Have you heard the story about the three professionals that were arguing who had the oldest profession? The architect, the medical doctor, and the liturgist. And so the medical doctor says, well, early in time in creation, God took Eve from the side of Adam. That was a surgical procedure. So you see, God, the most ancient profession, God was a medical doctor. And the architect says, oh, no, come on. In the beginning, God created order out of chaos. He was an architect. And the liturgist said, oh, you're both wrong. Who made the chaos? So we want to talk about Pope Benedict XVI and his what he has done for art and architecture, especially what he has written and spoken of. And I hope some of this you've already heard, but I hope some of it will, being good Americans, it will shock you a little bit, what he says about architecture, because as Paul Johnson said, what did Paul Johnson say that American Catholics were? You should get this in Grand Rapids. They're Calvinists who go to Mass. So I hope that you'll get a little shocked by this Pope who is not a Calvinist who goes to Mass. He never had any Calvinism in him. So let's talk about Pope Benedict. Italian water, you got to have that. This is, I'm just starting off with one of the many images of the Holy Father. Do you know where this is? This is when he went to Cuba, near the, well, at any rate, 2012. All right. The Pauline Chapel at Santa Maria Maggiore houses one of the most beautiful and historic icons of Rome, the Salus Populi Romani. It's a small image that is credited with ending the plague when Pope Gregory the Great carried it through the streets of Rome, 590. It is an ancient image housed within a Baroque chapel added on to the most ancient of Marian churches, a church Pope Benedict XVI described poetically as a Christmas church, inasmuch as the Nativity is not just a work of God, but also a work of his mother. It is this context that offers an analogy to much of Pope Benedict's writings on art and architecture. We see in this chapel an honoring both of antiquity, but also development in art and architecture of the church and her liturgy. How? First of all, there's the sophisticated Corinthian architecture within a centralized chapel with a dome. The expensive materials, including the blue lapis lazuli in honor of Our Lady, and a complex iconographic program. Believe it or not, the Baroque altar and shrine help project, and make prominent the ancient and small image of Salus Populi Romani. The architecture enframes this icon, helps our eyes to focus on this little image through contrast and harmony of design and shape. The retablo and the chapel in general are the architectural equivalent of a monstrance, or of a Spanish custodias procesionales. When Benedict was elected Bishop of Rome, he originally planned to celebrate his inaugural Mass inside of St. Peter's Basilica. Why? Because he said, the architecture better directs the attention towards Christ instead of the Pope. That's what he said about the inside of St. Peter's. However, his curia, in their infinite wisdom, told him there might be a few more people than can fit in St. Peter's that would like to come. And of course, they're right. And so they convinced him to relocate his inaugural Mass outside. I thought this was very perceptive of the Holy Father because he understood the ability of sacred architecture to assist the liturgy and to help us to worship God. In his writings, we find a pope who is very attuned to the importance of the arts, painting, sculpture, architecture, and music, along with might be called the ars celebrandi, the art of liturgy. Now, knowing the Pope had said this about the outside of St. Peter's, where there are these great outdoor masses, and look at that amazing baldacchino in front of the front door. Isn't that amazing? See that right there? It's almost as nice as this one. But knowing the Holy Father's concern about that and how to direct us towards Christ, which is what he wanted to do, I thought somebody really should design a proper baldacchino for the outdoor Mass. I don't know if you can see that, but we came up with a bronze baldacchino, not like Bernini's, but a big one that would shelter the altar outside for Mass, but something that also related to the beautiful facade of Maderno. In his own life as a priest, which has in large part been spent as a university professor or cardinal prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he has not had the occasion to be a patron of architecture. But he has included topics on art and architecture in his oeuvre and spent a substantial portion of his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, on the topic of architecture. Have you read that, Spirit of the Liturgy? I've just read the chapters on architecture. I don't know what the other stuff's about. But the ones on architecture are pretty good. I hear the other ones are pretty good too. So this is the church on the top left is the Shrine of Our Lady of Altötting. Anybody who speaks German in here, do not correct me. I have no idea what I'm saying. But this is the church that he would walk by on his way to school, and he would stop in and pray. And then down below is the seminary, bottom left, where he studied. And on the right, there he is praying in front of the baptismal font in the church of where he was baptized. Gives you a little feeling of his background. Now, in Images of Hope from 1997, almost all of his meditations on major feasts, he refers to art and architecture. These are not art historical treatments, but theological reflections on the elements found in the basilicas of San Paolo fuori le Mura, San Pietro in Vaticano, Santa Maria Maggiore, San Clemente, and the Porziuncola Chapel in Assisi, among others. In these, we see that art and architecture are bearers of meaning for Ratzinger, and he employs them to illustrate theological truths. For instance, concerning the Cathedra Petri in St. Peter's, he writes, "One would probably expect here a triumphal depiction of St. Peter, around whose tomb the church is built. But nothing of the kind is the case. What is this whole composition trying to express? What does it tell us? The window signifies through the dove of the Holy Spirit that God is the actual source of all light. But it tells us also something else. The church herself is in essence, so to speak, a window, a place of contact between the otherworldly mystery of God and our world, the place where the world is permeable to the radiance of his light. She is not an end, but rather a point of departure beyond herself and us." Ratzinger goes on to describe the chair as expressing the abiding presence of the apostle, who as teacher remains present in his successors. It is an empty throne which expresses the Petrine service as primacy in love, seen as a throne of the Eucharist. The fathers of the church embody the fullness of the faith, and thus love, that is the throne, stands on faith. He concludes, "The inner dynamics into which the altar draws us allows, finally, a last element to become understandable. The window of the Holy Spirit does not stand there on its own. It is surrounded by the overflowing fullness of angels, by a choir of joy. Love is participation, community, joy. We think we hear them singing, these angels, for we cannot imagine these streams of joy to be silent or as talking idly or shouting. They can be perceived only as praise in which the harmony and diversity unite." Was this exegesis of the Cathedra Petri intended by Bernini and his patron, Pope Innocent X? I would say yes, even if no one before Pope Benedict XVI has understood it in quite this way. Certainly, Pope Innocent and Bernini would be very pleased by this interpretation, since the role of a work of art is to express the truths of the faith in a way that can lead to reflection and can inspire us to live life more deeply. Pope Benedict articulated his view of interpreting sacred art in a meeting with Roman clergy in 2007. He said, "Art is a treasure of an inexhaustible and incredible catechesis." And that's what Authenticum does, right? Catechesis. "It is also our duty to know and to understand it properly, not in the way that's sometimes done by art historians who interpret it only formally in terms of artistic technique. Rather, we must enter into the content and make the content that inspired this great art live anew. It truly seems to me to be a duty, also in the formation of future priests, to know these treasures and to be able to transform all that is present in them and that speaks to us today in a living catechesis." Thus, we understand that Pope Benedict believes in the importance of Christian art and the necessity of priests to understand it and teach it to the faithful. During his travels as Pope, Benedict XVI often used the example of the church he is visiting to highlight its beauty, its importance in the history of the place, and then makes theological reflections on it. For instance, during his homily at St. Pat's Cathedral in New York in April 2008, he references the builder, Archbishop John Hughes, who wanted this cathedral to remind the young church in America of the great spiritual tradition to which it was heir, and to inspire it to bring the best of that heritage to the building up of Christ's body in this land. He then went on to draw attention to a few aspects of this beautiful structure, such as the stained glass windows, which flood the interior with mystic light, From the outside, those windows are dark, heavy, even dreary. But once one enters the church, they suddenly come alive. Reflecting the light passing through them, they reveal all their splendor. Many writers here in America, we can think of Nathaniel Hawthorne, have used the image of stained glass to illustrate the mystery of Christ, of the church herself. It is only from the inside, from the experience of faith and ecclesial life, that we see the church as she truly is, flooded with grace, resplendent in beauty, adorned by the manifold gifts of the Spirit. It follows that we who live the life of grace within the church's communion are called to draw all people into this mystery of light. Then he got to the good stuff, architecture. Like all Gothic cathedrals, it is a highly complex structure whose exact and harmonious proportions symbolize the unity of God's creation. The unity of a Gothic cathedral, we know, is not the static unity of a classical temple, but a unity born of the dynamic tension of diverse forces which impel the architecture upward, pointing to heaven. Here, too, we can see a symbol of the church's unity, which is the unity, as St. Paul has told us, of a living body composed of many different members, each with its own role and purpose. Pope Benedict's point about the complexity of St. Patrick's architecture and how it is analogous to the church's complex body. It also reaffirms the age-old tradition of calling our buildings not gathering places, but churches, due to the fact they symbolize and house the church. Finally, the Pope speaks of the exterior and how the faithful should emulate it in their lives. So again, now that idea of church that we apply to the building, he's taking the building and applying it to us. Isn't that interesting? Right? Isn't that what we usually do? We say, well, that's the church, that's where the people of God pray, and so we call it a church. Well, he's doing the opposite. Church building should give us a vision of how we live. So he says about the exterior, the spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral are dwarfed by the skyscrapers of the Manhattan skyline, yet in the heart of this busy metropolis, they are a vivid reminder of the constant yearning of the human spirit to rise to God. And when we leave this great church, let us go forth as heralds of hope in the midst of this city and all those places where God's grace has placed us. This is very poignant when you compare the majestic and sacred structure of St. Pat's to the secular city in which it is present. The cathedral becomes an example, a model for how we should live our lives as we look toward the greater city. A natural question results for us. How can we better build churches and produce art that offers inspiration and shows us concretely the truths of the faith? In particular, how can our churches point to heaven, be heralds of hope, and express the mystery of light and the unity of the body of Christ? Ratzinger's methodology of employing art and architecture to make theological points underscores the relevance of historical examples to our present predicament. I think it's fair to say that he is willing to be inspired by the full patrimony of the church, rather than to a specific golden age, as Pope Pius XII warned us against. The Pope wrote, "I did once say that to me, art and the saints are the greatest apologetics for our faith." Wow. Art and the saints. So we see him reference architecture from the synagogue and the temple up through the Gothic and the Baroque. In art, he has written or spoken on early Christian mosaics, Romanesque icons, medieval roofs, Renaissance altarpieces, and Baroque altars. Just as there's a very strong historical consciousness in his writings on liturgy, so is it in the arts. He writes, "In every age, Christians have sought to give expression to faith's vision of the beauty and the order of God's creation, the nobility of our vocation as men and women made in his image and likeness, and the promise of a cosmos redeemed and transfigured by the grace of Christ. The artistic treasures which surround us are not simply impressive monuments of a distant past. Rather, they stand as a perennial witness to the church's unchanging faith in the triune God, who, in the memorable phrase of St. Augustine, is himself beauty, ever ancient, ever new." In the spirit of the liturgy, Ratzinger devotes a number of chapters to the development of the Domus Ecclesia from both the synagogue and the temple. He relies heavily on Louis Bouyer's Liturgy and Architecture as the basis for his argument. But ultimately, whether the specifics of liturgy and architecture are confirmed by more recent scholarship, that is, whether the Jewish bema really became the choir and whether altars are located in the middle of the nave, which is what Boyer thought at the time, Ratzinger's point is to emphasize the continuity with the Jewish sacrifice in the temple, along with the reading of the word in the synagogue. At the same time, there is a change with the Christian liturgy and eventually within the church's architecture. The early church building, like the early synagogue, is based on the Roman basilica with aisles for circulation. Did you know that? That Christians and Jews were building very similar buildings at the same time? The synagogues look a lot like early Christian churches at that period. Okay, and there's one. There's our San Clemente, and then a reconstruction of the synagogue at, I can't even pronounce that, at Gush Halev, which is basically a little basilica. I don't know if you can see it. In his influential work on the history of orientation for Jews and Christians, Ratzinger connects the Oriens, or the East, with the resurrection and the symbolism of the cross. He writes, "That is why, whenever possible, we should definitely take up again the apostolic tradition of facing the East, both in the building of churches and in the celebration of the liturgy. Connected to this is the Christian innovation of locating the altar in the apse, which is the place," he says, "the place where heaven is opened up." The place where heaven is opened up. Later, the tabernacle is seen as equivalent to the place of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. Now, many problems are solved architecturally when the priest and the people face the same direction. The Benedictine arrangement of candlesticks and crucifix on the altar has had a great influence as well in helping to symbolize that both priest and people are focusing on Christ and his sacrifice. Do they do that in Grand Rapids ever? Benedictine arrangement? Upstairs even, wow. Fantastic. And this is really good stuff. Benedict's promotion of the hermeneutic of reform, of renewal in the continuity of the church, can also be applied to Catholic art and architecture. However, it is particularly interesting to me that he would refer to Guardini and Boyer in the spirit of the liturgy, because these two gents, very important for liturgy and other things, but they both shared many aspects of the hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture when it came to art and architecture. Why do I say that? For instance, Boyer is very critical of the medieval and Baroque architecture. If you read him, he hated that, like all good liturgists of the 40s and 50s. While Guardini collaborated, the Calvinist background, While Guardini collaborated and promoted the early work of Rudolf Schwartz. Do you know this building in Aachen? This is a very famous early church from 1929, Catholic church in Germany, by a great modernist architect, Rudolf Schwartz. And they ran out of money. They couldn't put any architecture on it. And when this was criticized by the people and by various people, including probably some priests, Guardini defended this building in very poetic fashion. Now, the great scholar of religion at Northwestern, Richard Kiekeffer, has pointed out that a fascinating aspect of this marriage of convenience between liturgists and architects was that the modernist architects did not share the vision of the liturgical movement for ressourcement and going back to the earlier or purer forms. Rather, the architects saw their work as a break with the past, but for some reason, the liturgists and the architects happily worked together. While Pope Benedict's work can be seen as being in continuity with tradition, there is also an important place for development and innovation in the arts. He argues for growth and progress, but not rupture. In his address concerning the hermeneutic of reform, he states that the nature of true reform is a process of innovation in continuity. Innovation in continuity. Talk to any architect or artist on the street and they'll all be for innovation, invention. What about innovation in continuity? Oh, I don't like that. No. Just innovation. I just like the first half. In his chapter on the altar and the direction of liturgical prayer, Ratzinger states, "The problem with a large part of modern liturgiology is that it tends to recognize only antiquity as a source, and therefore normative, and to regard everything developed later in the Middle Ages and through the Council of Trent as decadent. We cannot take as our norm the ancient in itself and as such, nor must we automatically write off later developments as alien to the original form of liturgy. There can be a thoroughly living kind of development in which a seed at the origin of something ripens and bears fruit." Okay, so this is St. Oswald in Tronstein, where he grew up. He celebrated his first Mass in 1951 in this church. It's kind of simple. Benedict's understanding of architectural and art history from the spirit of liturgy shows an appreciation of development while expressing a belief that there are also high and low points in our history. On a number of occasions, Pope Benedict has cited Gothic cathedrals and Baroque churches as exemplars in the same breath. For those, is there anybody in this room that is of the Gothic persuasion? Like, when you get to heaven, it's going to be Gothic, right? Yeah, good. For those of the Gothic persuasion, this may come as a surprise, but it is consistent with the hermeneutic of continuity. In English-speaking countries, there's an association of the Gothic style with churches, since it was seldom employed for other building types. Also, there are very few truly Baroque churches in America or in the Holy Land, Ireland. And our lack of experience with them may lead some of us to agree with Protestants that they are decadent or worldly. Benedict, however, having grown up in a country which is home to some of the finest examples of the Baroque and lived for a couple of decades in the city of Bernini, Borromini, and Cortona, asks us to broaden our vision. So all you Gothicists, I want you to broaden your vision. He explains that the Council of Trent led once more to a new kind of seeing that comes from and returns within. The Baroque altarpiece is like a window through which the world of God comes out to us. This art is intended to insert us into the liturgy of heaven. Again and again, we experience a Baroque church as a unique kind of fortissimo of joy, an alleluia in visual form. Baroque art and architecture is an alleluia in visual form. This seems consistent with his love of music, doesn't it? In particular, the Baroque music of Bach and Mozart. He said, "I think the great music born in the church makes the truth of our faith audible and perceivable. From Gregorian chant to the music of the cathedrals, to Palestrina and his epic, to Bach, and hence to Mozart and Bruckner, and so forth. In listening to all these works, the Passions of Bach, his Mass in B-flat, and the great spiritual compositions of 16th century polyphony, of the Viennese school, of all music, even that of minor composers, we suddenly understand it is true. Whenever such things are born, the truth is there. Without an intuition that discovers the true creative center of the world, such beauty cannot be born. Okay, and this is Freising Cathedral, where he celebrated Mass, and where he was the rector, and where of the seminary of the theologate, and where he was one of his co-cathedrals as Bishop of St. Mary and Corbinium when he was Archbishop of Munich and Freising. Have you been to all these buildings? Why don't we take a Ratzinger tour? I hear the food is pretty good too. And the music. In 2008, during his question and answer session with the clergy of Bressanone at their cathedral, he spoke about Baroque art and architecture's ability to visibly proclaim God, to make the mysteries concrete. He said, "If I look at this beautiful cathedral, it is a living proclamation. It speaks to us itself, and on the basis of the cathedral's beauty, we succeed in visibly proclaiming God, Christ, and all his mysteries. Here they have acquired a form, and look at us." He also said, "All the great works of art, cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals, and the splendid Baroque churches." Do you hear it again? You Gothicists? He wants you to look at the Baroque. I bet the Baroque people like the Gothic, but it's the Gothic people that don't like the Baroque, right? They're all kind of quasi-Anglicans, or maybe they're Irish. Maybe you're Irish. It's, we never had that stuff in our country. What do you want? Okay. So he also says, all the great works of art, cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals and the splendid Baroque churches, they are all a luminous sign of God, and therefore truly a manifestation, an epiphany of God. And in Christianity, it is precisely a matter of this epiphany that God became a veiled epiphany. He appears and is resplendent. Baroque art and architecture should be seen as Catholic in its essence, brought about in response to the iconoclasm and rejection of the faith by the Protestant Reformation. Church historian Edward Norman writes that Catholics emphasize those very aspects of their faith that most offended the Reformers. Right? Think about it. The intercession of the saints, number one. The holiness of relics, number two. The power of the church to bind and loose. And most importantly, the Eucharist. The Baroque became the architecture of the 17th century missions to the East and in the New World, and continues to be beloved in countries which were historically Catholic. So when you travel to South America or to Catholic Europe, Southern Europe, ask the people in Italy, Spain, Germany, Austria, and Poland what they think of the Baroque. The average guy in Italy or in Portugal or Spain, they like it. This is good stuff. They like the Gothic too. They like it all. Criticized by Protestant architects and architects of the Enlightenment for being too inventive and not referring enough to the ancient canons of classical architecture, the Baroque shares with the Gothic an expression of aspiration, exaltation, and a feeling of upward movement toward God. Both construction systems were bravura for their time and still give today's visitors a sense of amazement at the spatial and constructional effects. Interestingly enough, many of the Baroque architects look consciously at the Gothic for a blending of elements or for ways to enliven the architecture. I believe the Baroque exemplifies Benedict's ideal of art, which draws people into the mysteries by projecting out in proclamation. Though Pope Benedict sees a crisis in sacred art, and presumably sacred architecture as well, he expresses great optimism for the possibility of continuity with innovation. The main goal of sacred art and architecture is to produce beauty in service of the liturgy. And I'll end here. You know this great image, don't you? This is the Holy Father celebrating Mass in the Capella Paulina. And he's celebrating Mass ad Orientem, which he did all the time at the Sistine Chapel and other places. But this was the first time he celebrated Mass ad Orientem with a freestanding altar. So the chapel has a freestanding altar, but he still led the people in celebrating toward the east. So I'll finish with this last word from Holy Father Benedict XVI. Christian art is a rational art. Let us think of Gothic art, or of the great music, or even precisely of our own Baroque art. But it is the artistic expression of a greatly expanded reason, in which heart and reason encounter each other. This is the point. I believe that in a certain way, this is proof of the truth of Christianity. Heart and reason encounter one another. Beauty and truth converge. And the more that we ourselves succeed in living in the beauty of truth, the more that faith will be able to return to being creative in our time too, and to express itself in a convincing form of art. Thank you very much.
So I'm trying to teach about our architecture to our RCI as they're coming in so that they understand that when they're at the liturgy, the church is leading them in that liturgy.
Great.
And what I'm wondering is, there any kind of works out there? You're giving examples of the Pope Benedict talking about various churches. Is there any kind of like thought process that one has, I can do this, I can take them into the church by my catechesis of understanding, I can lead them in a thought meditation to understand the space, but are there any principles, or is there a book, is there a work of art out there that explains that process of thinking, or is it just something that we intuitively come to?
No, I think like probably everything else you do in catechesis and RCIA, you do it from reason. I mean, you do it from knowledge and study. So it should be the same with the arts and architecture. And I take my hat off to you for using the building to teach. I don't think you need a PhD in art or art architecture to do that, though. And I think you probably have a natural sensus fide. You have a natural sense of what the building can teach. But if you want to, why not do a little bit more reading on it? Read some things of Ratzinger's, The Spirit of the Liturgy, or that one nice book, Images of Hope, where he takes different famous works of art and he kind of does this theological meditation on what they really mean. He's not an art historian. He doesn't claim to be. He's trying to be a teacher and a preacher. There's a wonderful book by Dennis McNamara from Mundelein on also called The Spirit of the Liturgy, and it's about architecture, and he explains a lot of these things. It's probably a good one to look at. So my hat's off to you. But yeah, thank you.
Just to add to that, you're familiar with Sister Wendy, the art critic. There's a somewhat newer DVD of her going to different works of art that have inspired her.
Yes.
In her own spiritual life.
Yes.
That's a great one to get a hold of.
That sounds good. A
Yeah.
DVD by Sister Wendy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah, she's great. And she's kind of an untrained art historian, isn't she? And she, with a good eye and deep faith. Yep.
Are we to understand that you do like Baroque more than Gothic or not?
No, I just like to give Irish people and Germans a hard time. It's all good stuff. This is what I would argue for. that if we're Catholics, big C, we should be Catholic, small c, when it comes to art and architecture. We should embrace 2,000 years. We've 2,000 years of art, architecture, writing, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to one golden age, which is what Pius XII wrote against. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a favorite. Have your favorites, but learn to love the other stuff as well. It's not all. There's a lot of great stuff that we can learn from, and each epoch has created great art, and to pit one against the other, I think, is very unfortunate. I've actually been spending the last couple of years in my teaching at Notre Dame trying to undermine this typical art history view, which is, early Christian starts here, it ends then, you start the Romanesque, and then that ends here, and then they develop into the Gothic, and then that ends, and you have the Renaissance, and then that goes on, and then you get the Baroque, and then finally we get to the good stuff, modernism. So, and I try to undermine that by showing, like the Pope talks about, there's great continuity between these styles, especially as the style starts happening. There's a great continuity. The Renaissance wouldn't be the Renaissance if they didn't know the Gothic. The Renaissance is not purely Roman architecture reborn. It is seen through the lens of Christianity and the Gothic. They couldn't have done the Duomo in Florence without the Gothic. And you see that in the Baroque. The Baroque couldn't have done what it did without the Renaissance. The Gothic couldn't have done what it did without the earlier forms of the Romanesque and the ancient Roman thing. So it's much more interesting when you look at art history that way, because it's more like Catholicism, right? We build upon the apostles. We build upon the fathers. That's how we work. We build upon the saints. And there can be innovation, there's development, but we also see that continuity. So it's fun. I like giving people a hard time and trying to point out, this is a fun thing. Go to some great Gothic cathedrals, like I was just at Notre Dame in Paris, and Gothic cathedrals all have to have pointed arches. Go to Notre Dame and find all the round arches in there. That's fun. That's really fun. Because there's much more continuity, there's much more connection than you think. It's not either or, it's both. Yeah. That's Catholic art, yeah.
A question in regards to, if you could put your crystal ball, I guess. 20 years from now, do you think there'll be, like we talk about John Paul with a theology of the body, do you think they'll be talking about Benedict with a theology of beauty?
If I have my way. A lot of smart people have said that we're going to be digesting the work of John Paul II for a long time, and we're going to be digesting the work of Benedict for a long time. And I hope they're right. I mean, two brilliant scholar, intellectual popes. I guess you kind of heard it, but I didn't say it explicitly. But I can't think of it's been a long time since we had a pope write as much about art and architecture as Benedict. I mean, this was a man who really loved it and saw it and understood it, and he talked about it a lot. And it's a great gift. John Paul, St. John Paul, gave us that wonderful letter to the artists. It's a tremendous little essay that he wrote, which is brilliant, and you should all read it. And it's if you're not a theologian, you can still understand it. It's really good. But Benedict talked about it everywhere, all the time. And as he said, it's the greatest evidence for the faith is the saints and art. So I hope so.
Thank you for your talk. It was fantastic. I have a question on the last quote that you talked about with reason. And of course, one of the things in reading Benedict is this stress that he puts on reason from the Regensburg Address and then throughout all of his writings, and how faith rehabilitates reason. Could you discuss maybe a little bit more about the relationship between Benedict and then the Catholic understanding of rationality and its manifestation in art and architecture in his thought?
Well, I probably can't say much. I can only make up some stuff. It's interesting that, and I love to do this to Americans, the Europeans, I think, really see the connection between the Gothic and the Baroque. We do not, because we're in a Protestant culture and we imbibed that. And the Protestants hated the Baroque, right? That was the Counter-Reformation. That was the bad stuff. And of course, the iconography of the Baroque is over the top, and that's also bad, right? You never do that if you're good. a good Calvinist or even, well, anyway. So, but the amazing thing is that for instance, let's talk about a Gothic cathedral has a great Gothic cathedral has an incredible, there's an incredible geometric basis for it. Then there's an incredible, let's say, technical basis of putting stone on stone and yet making a perfect cylindrical column that is added to 5 other cylindrical columns that's holding up a vault that's going this way, that way, that way, and then it's going all the way up to the top to hold up the ceiling. So it's a very sophisticated, somebody to think about that, to draw it, and then to build it and to get it right, and to get everything right, and then to do it a couple of times all the way down the nave. So it's very rational, and it's hard to do, and of course, their computer-aided drawing programs were pretty weak in those days, and their engineering programs weren't so good either. Their calculators and slide rules weren't as good as they are today. But so there's a very strong rational side to it. The Baroque is, in its own way, also very geometric. In fact, it's probably among the most sophisticated geometrical games that you can play with architecture in terms of just drawing a plan. Try to draw a plan of a Baroque church, a great Baroque church by Bernini, or one of these great German Baroque or Rococo buildings. They're very complicated. And then to try to build that precisely, very complicated. And then to get like angels and saints like floating above the columns and off the walls and all that. This is hard stuff. I couldn't do that today. I can draw other stuff, I can build other stuff, but that's really hard stuff to do. So in that sense, they're technically difficult, they're technically hard to create in your mind, but they're very rational. They're all based on geometry and curves and circles and ovals and other things. And then of course, with the Baroque, there is that sense of heaven, right? It's all melding into heaven, so it's all taking the art and making the art part of the architecture, which they did so well. So I don't know if that doesn't answer your question, but it's just my fake. I just faked an answer. So I would love to hear somebody explain that to me about Benedict and faith and reason and architecture. Somebody should do that, but probably somebody smart like a theologian or a I don't know, art historian or somebody smart. You know what I mean? John Pinero. Yeah.
In your book, The Church Building as a Sacred Place, you have a picture of a modern church, and you said there's a caption under there, and it says, "The interior of the church is designed to create a sense of tension and distraction, which leads to fragmentation and disharmony." I think that is a great explanation of the modern church, but I'm curious as to what the modern architect, his intention was in building a modern interior like that.
Very good, very good. What building is that? Do you know? What is that one? Is that Peter Eisman's Church of the New Millennium? She's going to show it to me. It's really nice. Oh, okay. This is, you can't see this, but show it to you anyways. This is the church of the third millennium that the Vatican, actually it was the Diocese of Rome, had a competition for, and they hired one of our most famous American modernist architects who it has nothing to do with it. It just happens to be Jewish agnostic and has never designed a church before in his life and could care less about it, except it was for the Vatican, Richard Meyer. So what did the architects think they were doing? I think that in the early times when the liturgical movement, who were they thought they're going back to the good old days of, Jesus sitting around the table with the disciples, thought they're going back to that, or the early church, meeting in homes, breaking bread together, kumbaya, that kind of stuff. They thought they were going back. The modernist architects were not worried about that. They could care less about it. It's all about the new, technology and. But the liturgists like this going back stuff. We like the modern. We like building our churches to look like, as Le Corbusier said, like trains, boats, and he really liked grain silos in the Midwest. He thought that was a pure form, and that's what he wanted us to do, was to build buildings that were machines or like machines, as good as machines. And so that's really it was just really the church brought in these guys who wanted to do cool stuff, and the church said, great, we think that's of our time, and that's going to really bring in the young people, and it's going to really work for us. And so it was a kind of a marriage of convenience. What did they say? There's some pretty damning arguments. For the first, some pretty damning arguments. The famous church that most people, that everybody, all the architects love, and a lot of normal people like too, is Le Corbusier's Ronchamp, which was done in the late 50s before Vatican II required everybody to do ugly churches. Ronchamp is the great, it's a pilgrimage church, looks like that. And it was, they asked Le Corbusier what he was about. And he says, issues of religion had nothing to do with it. This is the architect that you just hired and gave him a lot of money to build your building. He says, issues of religion had nothing to do with it. And he says things about, light and like my experience going up to the Acropolis and the light coming in and, the light and, he was an unreformed Calvinist. He had rejected his Calvinist background. And that's what he said. What did the other guys say? I don't know, some good quotes. Somebody should do a book on that. Get the actual quotes of the architects. They don't usually say very smart things. The famous example is the Oakley Cathedral. I don't know if you remember this. 10 years ago, they had the great architect Calatrava, a Swiss fellow, and he designed the building that looked kind of like, and it went like this, and it was all glass. And he said it was the eye of God and things like that. And then they asked him about it, and he said the same kind of thing. It really has nothing. I didn't really design it for a particular religion. It's for all people. It's kind of he started saying kind of New Age kind of things. And I mean, these are architects who don't believe, and they don't even believe that what they're doing is expressing Catholicism. That's really interesting. And when you push them, they'll admit that. So it's Calatrava. So. I don't know why that's pretty surprising, but the new bishop fired him. But at any rate, so I don't know. That's a good question. What did they really say about it? I'd like to write that book, or I'd like to hire somebody to write that book for me of what the dumb quotes, the important quotes of modernist architects about their churches. I know. I have an argument with my friend, what is her name? She just was in Sacred Architecture, Tom. She did the modernist church history. She's a scholar at Yale, and she does modern sacred spaces. That's what her focus is on. And she probably has a divinity degree too. And she's very good. And I had this discussion with her, and I said, so let's talk about this. Of all the great modernist architects, and we're talking here like 1920 to 1950, 1960, that kind of period. And I said, were any of those people good Christians? She said, well, yeah, I think they were. Yeah, I think some of them were. And she went, okay. So there's Mies van der Rohe. Well, he was a lapsed Catholic. Okay, Le Corbusier. So he was a Calvinist who didn't believe. All right, so there's Alvar Aalto. Did a lot of churches in Finland and stuff. But how about Gropius? He was as anti-church as they get. We couldn't find any. The great famous modern architects, none of them came from Christian background. Some came from, they came from Christian background, but none of them were practicing. And I think it's very telling that modernism was really an agnostic architecture, or an architecture designed by agnostics, let's put it that way. And then various Protestant churches first, and then later on Catholic churches gave them money to build buildings for them. Why would you do that? You would do that if you didn't believe that the church building is a catechism in stone. If you don't believe that, then it's good. You just have a cool building. You have something neat up with the times. It's a machine, right? It's a really nice car or a really nice boat. But if you believe the building is a catechism in stone, the architect is actually helping to write that catechism. The architect is actually writing that sermon that you're writing. If you're a pastor or the patron of this building, you're writing a sermon that's going to be around for a long time. So it's kind of shocking. It's kind of horrendous that we did that and that we're still doing it.
If I might, I would like to take what you just said, add it to what you said previously about the each style building on a previous style in architecture.
Thank you.
And what I'm asking is, do you have, well, first of all, do you believe it's true that modern architecture, along with modern art, represents a break with the past that was kind of unique, that hadn't happened before in either art or architecture? And if you do, other than utilitarianism, which is obvious not only in modern churches, but in office buildings, even homes, what other cultural, say philosophical things shaped this complete rejection of things beautiful things that we inherited from our past? Why did it have to be such a radical break? Why couldn't we have built modern architecture on these, the beautiful aspects of the past?
Good point. Yes. Well, yes. So modern art, modern architecture, modern philosophy, modern music, modern ballet, you name it. It is a break with the past. And it was very consciously a break with the past for these great lights, the leaders, the people who formed it or started it. They were very conscious what they were doing. Picasso knew when he took a woman, he knew how to paint a woman in a classical pose, and then he dismembered her. He knew what he was doing. It is a break. It is a destruction of the human form, and in architecture was a destruction of the forms of architecture. And you don't have to believe me. You don't even have to believe your eyes. Don't believe your eyes. Don't trust them. You just have to read what they said. They were very conscious, very clear that this is a break with the past. This is a new era, it needs a new architecture. The best person to read is Le Corbusier, because he kind of rants and raves like he's a preacher, and he says all this stuff very clear, and he was followed by everybody else. Everybody admired him. So it was a break with the past. And what's the following point? Why? What was the reason driving them to break with the past? I think it's always related to culture and religion. It's related to faith or lack thereof. I mean, I see modernist architecture as without faith. It's either agnostic or atheistic. Now, your average architect isn't necessarily thinking that. I'm not saying that. Don't get me wrong. The average architect doesn't do this, but the leaders, as it were, the high priests of modern architecture, they knew exactly what they're doing. But then all of us followed along blithely and did what we were told. That's it. So, but I can spout nonsense, even though I don't mean to. And that's what modern architects have been doing for 80 years. They don't mean to. The average guy means to do something nice and of its time. But they're following an architecture that has this basis in iconoclasm and the machine, rather than in the human body and in continuity with our patrimony.
Thank you. This is a fascinating discussion. And
Yeah,
since
you guys
you were
are good.
here,
Yeah, you guys are pretty good.
I've always been curious about the role of the grotesque in art, too. I think of Flannery O'Connor, who's so intrigued by the grotesque, and I think about gargoyles on the cathedrals. And what role in art and in building and sacred spaces did the gargoyles play? Was it part of the catechism in stone? I've always been intrigued by that aspect of it. Not that I like modern ugly churches, but what is the role? What was the role of the gargoyles? And is there a modern place for that in our sacred architecture?
Okay. Well, so first I want to get everybody angry about the gargoyles, because in the 19th century, Viollet-le-Duc came in to restore the Gothic cathedrals of France, had a lot of money to do it, and he restored them not to the way they were, but to the way they should have been. And so one thing he did was he tore out the choir and the rood screen and the baldacchino that Louis the 14th or 15th had put into, which was all in the wrong style. It was Baroque. It was the wrong style, so he had to get rid of it. Took all that good stuff out. And, of course, he had to add, is it 500? 750, 1,000 gargoyles to that building? Those gargoyles are from the 19th century. Okay, and so he was kind of a friend of Flannery O'Connor. He loved the grotesque or whatever. He loved the playfulness of that. So all those great all those great gargoyles that you see on Notre Dame and Chartres, they were all put there in the 19th century. I say all of them. There might have been one or two that were left over from some drunken Irishman carving something, but they're pretty much all the 19th century. So So that's all I can say. I don't really have much to say about the grotesque. Otherwise, I'm not that interested in it. My clients don't pay me to do that kind of stuff these days. But I'm not saying they're bad or evil or anything. They're just of evil spirits. They're not evil.
One more?
Oh, yes.
I'm thinking of the churches in southern Poland, which were built by the handiwork of the people, and the art and architectural forms were developed by those people. How does that fit in with these great cathedrals and churches of the rest of Europe?
Good, good. He's taking us to the other Holy Land, Poland. I have a special part of my heart in Poland because I'm 50% of that, 50% Polak. Anyway, yeah, I don't know those churches per se, but I know that I've been to Poland, and I know that there's a great tradition of art and architecture there, and they too are they're kind of silly like Benedict. They like the Gothic and the Baroque, and two great times of architecture in those countries. Part of it too, with the Baroque, that's kind of interesting, is that in Italy they had this great thing called the Renaissance. By the time it starts, around 1420, by the time the Renaissance gets to Germany and and even France and maybe Spain and certainly Poland, by the time the Renaissance gets there, the Baroque is in style. So they don't have a lot of Renaissance stuff because they just jump from the Gothic into the Baroque. Go right for it, guys. Come on. So, but no, I think you bring up an interesting point so there's the great stuff, and then there's, let's say, the vernacular, the way the little people do it in their hometown with the best they have, and they use the materials at hand and so on, and the sensus fidelium, they do the best they can, and they're quaint, or they're beautiful, or they're not so good, but they're fine, and that's what we do. That's what we do. We have the great stuff, and in the great cities, like Grand Rapids, and we have the little people with the little stuff, and it's all good. It's all good. But the thing that changes is once you have a profession, the second oldest profession of architects, you actually have professionals that are architects, you can do great stuff anywhere, even in Grand Rapids, even in South Bend. You can build really nice things because you have somebody who's actually gone to school and been trained to do architecture. So you actually see from the Renaissance on. Here's an interesting thing. In the Gothic, generally, the great buildings, the great architecture that's survived are the cathedrals. What of the little chapels? What of the little this, the little that? The Renaissance has the professional architect. Little chapels can also be gems, right? We're spreading the wealth. We're having really fancy architects do little tiny chapels, which you don't find as much in the Gothic. You're spending your money on the big things. And that continues. And that's what we see in the 19th, 20th century in this country. We see some very good architects doing that. But the vernacular tradition is part of our tradition. I love it. And of course, the Polacks that came to this world all tried to bring that into their churches here. You go to Chicago or whatever, and you see all these huge Polish cathedral-like churches that are often a very bad mix, a very interesting mix of Gothic and Baroque. So with that, we want to thank you for coming. I'm honored to be here. Beautiful church upstairs, nice people downstairs.